The summer heat was relentless, bearing down on everything and everyone. It was the kind of heat that melted your willpower along with your popsicle, making even the simplest tasks feel like monumental efforts. I was 15, bored, and desperate for some cash. The days seemed to stretch endlessly, each one hotter than the last. Enter Scoops, the local ice cream parlor, my salvation disguised as a summer job. It was a beacon of hope in the sweltering heat. Little did I know, Scoops would serve up a whole lot more than just sundaes and milkshakes. It was a place where stories were shared and memories were made. The moment I stepped inside, a chill ran down my spine. The cool air was a welcome relief, but there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't just the air conditioning that sent shivers through me. A man stood behind the counter, his back to me. He seemed to be lost in his own world, meticulously arranging the ice cream scoops. He was tall and imposing, a figure that commanded attention even in the casual setting of an ice cream shop. The name tag pinned to his shirt read, Jim. It was a simple name, but it carried an air of mystery. He was wiping down the counter with one hand, a single solitary hand. Each movement was deliberate, almost ritualistic. His other sleeve hung empty. My pulse quickened as I realized he had only one arm. I'd never seen anyone like him before. There was something both fascinating and unsettling about his presence. I averted my gaze, feeling a mixture of curiosity and unease. What kind of stories did this man hold? My initial excitement about the job was suddenly replaced by a creeping sense of dread. The air seemed thicker, the room quieter. What had I gotten myself into? The summer job I had hoped would be a simple escape from boredom was quickly turning into something far more complex and mysterious. The first few days at Scoops were agonizing. Jim, my coworker, barely spoke. He moved with a quiet intensity that both fascinated and terrified me. His silence was deafening. Every time I tried to strike up a conversation, it felt like talking to a brick wall. He communicated mostly through gestures, pointing to the tubs of ice cream or nodding curtly in response to my questions. His one hand worked tirelessly, scooping, blending, and serving with surprising dexterity. He was a man of few words, that much was clear. One particularly slow afternoon I tried again. Desperate to break the ice, I asked him about his favorite flavor. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me. His eyes, a piercing blue, held my gaze. Then he simply turned away and continued working. I was crushed. Days turned into weeks. I was getting used to the rhythm of the ice cream parlor, the clatter of spoons, the whirring of the milkshake machine, and the oppressive silence from Jim. He remained an enigma, a puzzle I couldn't solve. One humid afternoon, the sky turned an ominous shade of gray. The wind picked up, howling through the streets. The radio crackled with warnings of an approaching thunderstorm. Customers dwindled, leaving the parlor eerily empty. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. A collective gasp escaped my throat. I fumbled for my phone, my heart pounding in my chest. The storm raged outside, unleashing its fury on the town. Panic surged through me. I hated the dark, always had. The shadows seemed to close in, making it hard to breathe. Every creak and groan of the house felt amplified, like the walls were whispering secrets I couldn't understand. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was a gentle touch, but in that moment it felt like a lifeline. I flinched, expecting it to be Jim. My heart raced, and I braced myself for the worst. But it was Mrs. DeLuca, an elderly lady who lived across the street. Her presence was unexpected but comforting. "Don't you worry, dearie," she said, her voice trembling. "Jim's got this." Her words, though shaky, carried a weight of reassurance. I looked over at Jim. He was always the brave one, the one who faced challenges head-on. He was lighting candles with his one hand, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. The soft glow cast shadows that danced around the room. He moved with a calm assurance that surprised me. Every movement was deliberate, every action filled with purpose. He wasn't afraid of the dark or the storm. It was as if he thrived in these moments of uncertainty. He seemed to exist outside of fear, a beacon of calm in the chaos. His presence was a stark contrast to the turmoil around us. He finished lighting the candles, and then, to my astonishment, he began to sing. The melody was soothing, a balm to my frayed nerves. His voice was deep and resonant, filling the darkness with an unexpected warmth. It was like a lighthouse guiding ships through a storm. It was a sea shanty, a song of storms and bravery. The lyrics spoke of courage and resilience, of facing the unknown with strength. My fear began to subside, replaced by a sense of awe. In that moment, I realized that with people like Jim and Mrs. DeLuca by my side, I could face anything. The next day, the town was buzzing with the storm's aftermath. Downed trees, power outages, and flooded streets were the hot topics of conversation. As I walked to Scoops, I overheard snippets of conversation, whispers about Jim.
Did you hear? Jim stayed at the ice cream parlor all night with Mrs. DeLuca. She was trapped there after the storm knocked a tree onto her house. That Jim, he's a good man. Quiet, but good. They say he lost his hand saving a child from a burning building. A true hero, that one.
I listened intently, my perception of Jim shifting with each whispered word. The mysterious man with one hand was no longer an enigma. He was a puzzle whose pieces were finally starting to make sense. The following weeks saw a shift in our dynamic. I no longer feared Jim's silence. I'd learned to read his expressions, his gestures. I found myself looking forward to our shifts together. One afternoon, a group of teenagers swaggered into Scoops. They were loud and obnoxious, throwing their weight around and making a mess. Jim watched them silently, his jaw clenched. I could feel his tension from across the room.
"Hey, one-handed wonder," he scoffed. "How about you scoop me up a triple scoop cone, if you can manage it, that is."
My blood ran cold. I wanted to intervene, but something held me back. Jim didn't flinch. He met the teenager's gaze, his blue eyes burning with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. He didn't say a word, but his silence spoke volumes. It was a silence filled with a quiet strength, a refusal to be intimidated. The teenager, taken aback by Jim's unwavering stare, stumbled over his words. He mumbled something incoherent and shuffled back to his friends, his face flushed with embarrassment. Jim finished serving them, his movements precise and controlled.
"Kids these days," he muttered, shaking his head.
It was the most he'd said to me since I started working there. One evening, as we were closing up, I finally summoned the courage to ask Jim about his hand. He was wiping down the counter, his movements mechanical and precise.
"Jim," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. I was just wondering about your hand."
He paused, his hand hovering over the counter. He looked at me, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a network of scars that ran the length of his arm. He didn't need to say a word. His scars told a story of pain, sacrifice, and resilience. They were a testament to a past he didn't speak of, but one that had shaped him into the man he was today. The summer was drawing to a close. Soon I'd be heading back to school, leaving Scoops and Jim behind. The thought filled me with a strange sense of melancholy. I'd grown attached to the old ice cream parlor and the man who ran it with quiet strength. One Friday night, I was scheduled to close up with Jim. It was late and the streets were deserted. We were just about to lock up when a group of men, their faces obscured by hoodies, approached the parlor. My heart pounded in my chest. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Something wasn't right. "Jim," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Look." Jim turned towards the door, his eyes narrowing. The men had stopped outside, their shadows stretching menacingly in the dim light of the street lamps. They were talking amongst themselves, their voices low and guttural. One of the men, who appeared to be the leader, pulled a crowbar from his jacket. The metal glinted under the streetlight, sending a chill down my spine.
"Stay here," Jim said, his voice low and steady.
He moved with a swiftness that belied his size, positioning himself between me and the door. He didn't hesitate. He didn't flinch. He was a protector, a silent guardian, ready to face whatever danger lurked outside. The men burst through the door, their faces contorted with anger. They hadn't expected Jim. They'd expected an easy target, an empty ice cream parlor ripe for the taking. They were wrong. I watched in awe as Jim, using a combination of speed and sheer strength, disarmed the intruders. His movements were precise, almost as if he had rehearsed this scenario 1,000 times. He moved with a grace that was almost balletic, his one hand a blur of motion. Each step he took was calculated, every action deliberate, showcasing a mastery that left me breathless. The men, clearly outmatched, scrambled back out the door and disappeared into the night. Their hurried retreat was a testament to Jim's overwhelming presence and skill. Jim turned to me, his face etched with concern. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, but his focus had shifted entirely to my well-being.
"Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with a tenderness I'd never heard before. It was as if, in that moment, nothing else mattered but my safety.
I nodded, speechless. The words seemed to escape me, lost in the whirlwind of the night's events. I just witnessed a side of Jim I never knew existed. This quiet, unassuming man had revealed a depth of character and strength that was both surprising and inspiring. He wasn't just a quiet ice cream scooper, he was a man of many layers, each one more intriguing than the last. He was a protector, a fighter, a man who faced danger head-on. His resolve was unwavering, his courage undeniable. That night, as we finally closed up the ice cream parlor, a silent understanding passed between us. We didn't need words. The bond we had forged in the heat of the moment was stronger than any conversation we could have had. We had shared something profound, something that went beyond the scoops and cones and sticky floors of scoops. It was a connection born out of adversity, a mutual respect that would forever change our relationship. We had faced our fears together, and in doing so, we had forged a bond that would last a lifetime. In that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, side by side.